Welcome to the Summit Racing Facebook Friday Fun Day. I'm Al Noe with Summit Racing Equipment. Joining me is my friend and coworker, Jim Grasso.
Hello, everybody.
Today we are joined by a very, very special guest. He ties in with our theme this year of Great American Success Stories and also ties in with the Summit Racing theme of Powered by Enthusiasts. So far this year, we've had Jay Leno, Ken Lingenfelder, Don Garlitz, Larry Nance, David Freiberger, Frank Hawley, and now the one and only Brian Lohnes. Brian's history is amazing. And Brian, I'm going to read a lot of this, what I stole shamelessly from the internet. I say that with most of our guests because I do a little bit of research. So I know it's all true because it's on the internet, right?
Of
so
course, absolutely.
Any glaring errors, just point it out, say wrong, totally off base. But I think I'm pretty safe here. So you began drag racing while attending the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in the late 90s and early 2000s. You started first at Lebanon Valley Dragway, where good friend of mine, Mark and Scott Hamill, have raced for years. Very good racing family up there. You established your career while working for more than a decade at New England Dragway in Epping as an announcer, tech inspector, race director, and track official. So you've kind of done about every job there, which is pretty impressive. While growing your role in the sport, you also worked as a journalist for drag racing and automotive publications. You started bangshift.com in 2008 with our friend Chad Reynolds. Shout out to Chad, who's a great guy. And that popular website continues on today, and Chad is still flying the flag at Bangshift today. You were a traveling national event announcer. You started with IHRA in the early 2000s. You called the majority of events for more than half a decade. Your first event with NHRA was 2014 at the Gator Nationals. Your television work began the following season. You were a top-end reporter for E3 Spark Plugs and their ProMod programming. Your role with NHRA has grown from that point. You progressed to announce every national event, and you worked more deeply with the whole TV production crew. You continue to announce some specialty outlaw small-tire drag racing event on weekends away from NHRA Mellow Yellow. I say Mellow Yellow. It's no longer Mellow Yellow. Now it's Camping World.
Camping World, baby.
Series tour. That's what you get for picking stuff up off the internet, folks. So, Brian, thank you for taking the time with us today. It is awesome to have you here. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm very appreciative to be here, and the list of folks that you've had on this broadcast previously makes me very nervous to be trying to live up to the billing here, man.
Brian, I'll tell you. Well, before this started, Jim and I were talking about just the awesome history with NHRA announcers. So aside from our guests that we've had on Facebook, you're in some tremendous company too. I mean, some of the people that I think all of us grew up listening to, McClellan, Evans, Fry. I mean, we can go on and on. And the thing I love about having someone like you on is because somewhere there's probably some 16-year-old kid, hopefully not skipping school. If you're on your lunch hour, kids, it's all right. If you're watching this later, it's good, but stay in school. But there's probably some younger people looking up to you saying, how did that guy get to be doing what he's doing? I want to do that. I love going to my track. And just like all of us, you just love doing what you do. And so it's awesome to have you on here because of the history with all the different NHRA announcers. And also your history, I think, is amazing, how you got to where you are today. So how about telling us about some of that history? I think all of us grew up building cars, getting our hands dirty. I built a couple cars in my parents' garage. I'm thankful they never threw me out for doing that after catching stuff on fire and painting a car and smoking everybody out of the house. It just my parents were very patient, so thanks, Mom and Dad. But with your history, you grew up with a dad who was really into it. So tell us about that, what it was like growing up, your first car, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so my dad was a racer in the 70s, and really up until I showed up into the picture in the early 80s when the stork dropped me off. He got out of racing for a while, but he never got away from cars, and certainly we never got away from like watching drag racing. When I was very little, he restored a 1964 Pontiac GTO, which he still owns, 4-speed, single 4-barrel car, got the real wood rim wheel in it. It's a neat piece, and awesome. That car really formed the basis for how I fell in love with muscle cars and how I fell in love with all this stuff. We used to take it all over the place. There was a place in Natick, Massachusetts called Nick's that actually was once profiled in the old Carcraft Cruise in America series. They used to go to cool cruise night spots back in the 80s and 90s. So Nick's was this little kind of fried seafood place that people would show up with. And it was a little place, but there'd be like 100 cars would show up every Saturday night, and everything from these crazy, this guy named Rick Fenwick had this crazy Pro Street Mustang that ended up getting featured in some magazines. And guys would trailer stuff and idle it in, and other guys would just be driving their muscle cars in. And, from that, it was just being able to do something with that car. We used to take it to the Pontiac Nationals. I mean, we drove that car a lot. We actually did a time distance rally with that car when we were kids. And I think back of that now, and it was cool because we showed up and there was all these guys that had these like computers and stuff in their car. And it was me, my sister, my mom, and dad in this GTO. And they kind of laughed us out of the place, which was fine. We had a blast. I mean, you're driving along, you're trying to find these checkpoints, you're trying to do everything on time. And I think we were, timing the thing on a little Casio digital watch, but it was great. And, through all those experiences is really how I fell in love with cars. And then, the drag racing thing really came about because my dad was an enthusiast, and we watched, as you guys grew up doing the same thing I did, watching TNN and then later ESPN and wherever it was on. I still have basically every single one of the Diamond P VHS tapes that were released. That was a yearly thing. Every Christmas, it was like I would wait, and usually it was one of my aunts would buy me one or two of the tapes, whether it was the Monster Truck tapes or And They Walked Away or, Drag Racing 92. And, those were the things that really fueled my interest in cars. And the cool thing about American Sports Cavalcade was, of course, we love the drag racing coverage, but I mean, you'd see IMSA races on there, and it's like you'd watch guys racing these prototypes, and you'd see stock car racing on there, and it exposed me as a kid to these different types of racing. They used to race big rigs. I mean, every once in a while they'd show the Great American Truck Racing Series on there. And I think that for me was always something, especially with regard to Steve Evans and Brock Yates and Dave McClellan, that bring me back. And, I'm friendly, very pleased and happy to be friendly with Cam Evans, Steve's son. And, Steve Evans to me was just an incredible voice, an incredible guy, an incredible kind of ambassador for racing. And I just, if there's anybody that I hope is in the ether kind of going, man, that guy's doing a good job, it's Steve Evans. And to your point, I honestly hope that there are people, whether it's kids or teenagers or even guys in their 20s that maybe hopefully see me as an example of someone that they'd like to try to emulate it professionally. So, growing up and then I got my first car when I was a kid. It was 84 Monte Carlo with a 305 and a quadrojet on it, and did all the same.
Flip the air cleaner lid upside down.
Oh, you better believe it, baby. You better believe it.
That qualifies you right away. It's like, all right, Brian, you're in.
And this is totally not just stroking you guys because we're talking on the Summit broadcast. The very first speed part I ever bought for my car, which wasn't actually really a speed part at all, I bought a set of Krager SS wheels, 15x7 Krager SS wheels from the Summit catalog with my own money. Back when you used to have to put the money order in the envelope and lick it and then mail it in. And it was great. I mean, that was like the really kind of launch for me personally into working on stuff and outside of working on stuff with my dad. And it's kind of gotten worse from there, I guess.
That's awesome. You mentioned Steve Evans. Remember the Performance Parts, Performance Plus, I think it was called, the show that he announced on? I remember meeting him with his son, Cam, and Cam's a good friend, same as you. And I remember meeting him, and it was so surreal, Brian. It was like, am I really meeting this guy that I've watched for years? And I'm like, and Cam's like, just dad, it's just a big deal, you know?
Right.
But it was the coolest experience. It was so neat. So I am sure, Brian, at some point you're going to have someone come up to you with these big wide eyes and be like, oh my gosh, you're the guy on the NHRA races. So it's cool stuff.
Hey, Brian, we all have that defining moment, I mean, we're all car guys, right? But what was that moment where you're like, let me be on this side of the mic instead of on that side of the mic? For me, I had an NHRA guy owned the local Amoco station next to me, and I see that car leave every weekend, and I'm like, that's where I want to be, some way, shape, or form. But then it steers you. Mine was at Summit Racing on this side of it. So what was it for you?
It's interesting, and I kind of think about this sometimes because it's really tough for me to pinpoint one thing. And the reality is, all I ever wanted to do is just write for car magazines, which thankfully I got the chance to do for several years as a freelancer, and still occasionally do some of that stuff today. And so the announcing thing came really kind of out of the blue a little bit. So the very first announcing it at the drag strip, it was Lebanon Valley. But prior to Lebanon Valley, I was part of the UMass Motorsports Club. And I was the black sheep of the group because there was about 12 guys in the club. I was the only guy that was into drag racing. Everybody else was into road racing. So we actually went and got budget from the school. It's a true story. We went and got budget from the school, the University of Massachusetts. We bought a 1978 Volkswagen Rabbit. We got enough budget to have a guy put a roll cage in it for us, and we kind of hit up our parents for some money, and we scraped some money together. And we used to race this thing in the SCCA in a category called ITC. Now, this wasn't autocrossing. This was actual road racing. We would go to Lime Rock and New Hampshire International Speedway and Nelson Ledges. We raced. We really went to Mid-Ohio one time. I mean, we went all over the damn place with this thing. And what ended up happening was, like, our second season, where I was reading the SCCA regional newsletter, and they said that they needed an announcer. And my buddies are like, because I always like to make people laugh and kind of be a ham when we're in the group. And they'd say, you should go try this. So I said, okay. So I went, and they had no other people wanted to do it. So I was up there, and it was very clear within about 15 seconds that I had no idea what I was doing, but I was enthusiastic about it. And the guy who was operating, this was at New Hampshire International Speedway. It was the first time I ever did this, which is pretty intimidating because I was actually up in the NASCAR booth overlooking the entire facility. You're looking down at, and it's an incredible vantage point.
Sure.
But end of the day, the guy who's running the racetrack, this guy named Ted, comes up, and I can't remember Ted's last name, but he comes up and he said, okay, a couple things. You've never done this before, right? I said, in my head, I'm thinking, well, that's not a good sign. I said, no. He said, you're very enthusiastic. He said, your voice sounds pretty good. He said, but you really got to figure out kind of what's going on the racetrack. And it was cool for me. That may have been a defining moment in some sense because I really threw myself into it at that point. And I spent basically the whole season doing SCCA stuff, and that got my confidence up. Once I got comfortable with that, I always wanted to announce at the drag strip. But once I got the idea that I needed to be good enough to get in front of people to do this, I felt very comfortable doing the road racing stuff because there was really nobody there. I was talking to the racers, so it wasn't as intimidating an environment. Whereas at a drag strip, there's always somebody sitting there watching.
Sure.
So effectively, that now that I think of it, and I wasn't necessarily going to say this, but now that I think of it, that probably was a singular defining moment because it taught me very clearly, and by a guy who took some pity on me, what I needed to do to be successful at this, which is to show up and put in the work to understand not only the sport, but understand the people, understand the cars, understand the rules, understand all the stuff. So once I got a full season of SCCA under my belt, and I think I was doing a pretty good job by the end of it, I called this guy named Glenn Groh, who at the time was running Lebanon Valley Dragway, and I actually emailed him. And where I went to school was only about an hour away from Lebanon Valley. It was a couple hours away from Epping. And so I asked him if I could come try out or do it, or if he had any openings. And like every drag strip always does, of course they had an opening. They never have enough people. To this day, you'll never find a drag strip that actually has enough employees. And so I went up there on a Saturday, and he put me in the tower with this other guy, and we worked the whole day. And he said, look, we only got like 3 weeks of the season left, but I want you for the next 3 Saturdays. And so that really was like the confidence booster. Got out of school for the summer, and I had been racing at New England Dragway with my dad. I bracket raced for years with my father. Horrible at it. I was a terrible bracket racer beyond all measure. And my dad is a saint because he didn't strangle me on the way home from either blowing it at the finish line or just completely being awful at the starting line. But I called New England Dragway, talked to Joe Lombardo, who ran the track. And then basically my weekly schedule in the summertime was I'd work my job. I'd go up to Epping on Wednesday night. I'd work in tech for the first half of the night, and then I'd announce. Then I'd work my job on Friday, work in tech, work the second half of the night on Friday, basically announce the whole day Saturday, and then I'd go up and race with my dad on Sunday. And then when we go back to school, I'd go back to doing the SCCA stuff. So I was doing the SCCA stuff really in like the fall, and then into the spring, or I should say in the spring into the early summer. Then I'd really transition into the drag racing stuff. And the height of this early part of my life came when I would work on Friday night at Lebanon Valley. Then I would drive like 3 hours, and I'd get to Epping at like 1 o'clock in the morning. And then I'd work at Epping on Saturday and Sunday. And many people have heard the story 1,000 times, but the guy who was running Epping saw me one night. He had left very late, and he saw me pulling into the parking lot, and I had made these little screens to put in the windows of my truck because it would be hot, and I want to sleep in the cab. So I made these little window screens so the mosquitoes didn't eat me alive. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to sleep." I said, "It's like 1:30 in the morning." And he gave me a key and he said, "Just sleep in the tower." And so for the next several years, I slept in the tower at New England Dragway on the weekends while I was, between announcing stuff. And that was my earliest kind of getting going in this thing. And to me, outside of Ted, that guy giving me the information, giving me the advice to say, "Hey man, like, put the work in." The thing that clicked for me was at New England Dragway, there was grandstands in the way that the place used to be set up. There was a grandstand that was like almost eye level to the tower, and the people you could almost reach out and touch them. And I would kind of like during the week almost work on material a little bit, and I'd say stuff and I'd kind of peek out the window. And when you see people reacting to things you say, I'm not a stand-up comedian, but the stand-up comedians talk about it all the time. Like that's what kind of goes,
Sure.
"Oh, okay, I can affect it." So I guess that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but those are two kind of defining moments, I guess.
Oh, good information. And it's that adrenaline rush. When they react to your joke, as they say, right? You're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
keep feeding it. And that's the dopamine that's coming in for sure. For sure.
Yeah, and there were nights, back then, I mean, Wednesday night and Friday night testing tunes, there was no real leash on what I could or couldn't say. So I got I think it was only once, but at one point I had to tell Joe, I said, "Hey, when I leave tonight, you got to get the cop over here to walk me to my car, because there's about 4 guys at the bottom of the building that want to kill me right now."
Sure.
Because you'd see some horrible looking car come up and it'd say it looked like it got pulled out of a swamp, or you kind of be cutting up. The fans would love it, and all of a sudden you look out the window and the guy's friends would be just staring at you like, so all valuable lessons.
So Brian, when you look back, is there anything that as you walk through life and you got to the point where you're at, you would do different? Maybe not make fun of that really big guy who wanted to kill you at the bottom of the tower, but is there anything that you look back on and you say, I might have done this differently, or I might have changed it? And it's all in hindsight, right? But it's always an interesting conversation about what would have been different. Is there anything that comes to mind?
I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about stuff like that, only because I really feel fortunate, from where I was and where I'm at. I feel very fortunate, and I feel like every experience I've had has helped me to get to this point. I mean, for the first 10 years when I got out of college, I was working regular jobs as well as doing all this announcing and freelancing stuff on the side. So I would work as a operations manager. I managed truck fleets. I managed drivers. I worked, in some pretty decent management jobs for a long time. We started Bank Shift, Chad, myself, and David Freiberger in 2008. And, that was when the economy had tanked and stock market had hit the skids. And it was actually, in hindsight, it was a great time to start a business, because it was, the kind of the right thing for the right time. And 2009, David had to go back to the magazine company because they called him back and he couldn't turn that down because the website wasn't making a nickel yet. And November 11th of 2011, coming up here in a few weeks, it'll be 10 years. That was the last day that I actually held what we call a traditional job. And from that point forward, it's been Bank Shift, and it's been automotive media, and it's been race announcing, and it's been television work and stuff like that for me. So the 10 years I spent actually working real jobs and that have real consequences and real responsibilities also were incredibly important. And I always tell people, I get emails and communicate with a lot of young announcers and people that want to come up and, how do I get into this full time? And it's like, I always tell them, don't do this full time yet. And it's very difficult to do this full time if you don't have, a knock on wood, thankfully, a job like I have with the NHRA and Fox. But I always tell them, you got to go to work. Don't try to make this your full time life's passion to start with. Sure. Build a base of work responsibility, build a base of experience that then you can take and make yourself multifaceted.
I know you mentioned earlier about you always wanted to be a writer for magazines. So, we get the NHRA National Dragster in here, sure, every month. And I want to share something with you. You wrote an article recently about there is such a bad day at the racetrack, I'm sure. And, reading that article, knowing what transpired at the event, there was so much emotion in that. I'm at my desk reading that article, and to be honest with you, I got emotional. So, just hats off to you for your writing skills. And people do read it. And I'm going to tell you that the words and the emotion that you put into that, as a reader that wasn't at the event, I really felt all the emotions that was going on. So congrats to you. And that was just an awesome article. I really wanted to share that with you because it certainly touched me. It really did.
Thank you. And I feel like if I have a strength, if I have any strength, it is a true love for the sport and the people that are involved in the sport. And it's, I've choked up on air a couple times over the last couple of years. You kind of run into emotional stuff every once in a while. And I feel like that's fine. I don't feel like that's something to be ashamed of or to run away from. I feel like if you can watch that Charlotte race and not have your heart just split into pieces watching what happened to Joey Gladstone, I don't know what you're watching for at that point, right? This sport will take every single thing you have. Sure. And sometimes it'll take everything you have and make you feel like a hero. And sometimes it'll take everything you have and make you wonder why you woke up in the morning. So I think it's important for anybody who's announcing anything, whether it's baseball or curling or drag racing or monster trucks, if you don't actually love what you're doing, the audience is going to know in a split second, especially when we're talking about cars and car people and gearheads and enthusiasts. You guys know this. They'll smell a phony from a half mile away. Sure. From a half, they'll know within 3 sentences whether you know what you're talking about, whether you care about what you're talking about or not. And I could never live with myself if I was ever trying to be that guy.
Well, that article doesn't seal it, I don't know what will. But just again, congrats, and very well written, and it was cool. It was really cool. I'm sure that Joey and everybody that was involved in Gel appreciated it as well. So.
I heard from a couple of them, and they did read it, and it's always interesting when you get I read your story ... And it's like, okay, here we go.
You wonder what's coming next, right?
Exactly. Right. Yeah, whether we're gonna high five or I gotta bob and weave, but no, I'm glad they all saw it and they appreciated it, so it's a good thing.
Yeah. Good. Brian, with all the racers that you've met and interviewed, and you mentioned being so integral to the sport, being so interested, enthusiastic, just you're in it. Who have you met that when you've met them and you've interviewed them, you're just thinking, I cannot believe that I am meeting this person? Like it's, we talked a little earlier, Don Garlitz, and they having him on. I remember the first time I met him, I was like, I worked in a Nationwide Auto Parts in high school, and Kendall Oil. Okay. We'd have a guy who came in, and we called him the Kendall guy. Sure. He'd always come in to do an oil change, and we'd ask, like you would, well, sir, what can we get for you? You know what? If it's good enough for Big Daddy, it's good enough for me. And that was the famous line from this guy. Sure. And it always stuck with me. The guy was great customer. But when I met Don Garlitz, it was so surreal. And I know you've had to have similar experiences where you met someone and you're like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe this. Is there anybody who comes to mind?
Yeah. Obviously Don Garlitz is one of them. Don Prudhomme. I recently, about a year ago, did some stuff with Humpy Wheeler. Those are people. You feel fortunate to talk to them because, one, they're still around. I mean, the thing that stinks is the march of time takes so many of these people from us before you have a chance to interact with them or ask them questions or whatever. When we did the unfinished business at the Gator Nationals back in 2019, we did these 2 sets of roundtables I hosted them with the 4 drivers, and we did these interviews. So it's like I'm in this room with Ed McCulloch, Don Garlitz, Shirley Muldowney, and Terry Vance. And then it's like, but wait, now we're going to do one with Warren Johnson. And, it's like, it was an embarrassment of riches. But the first time I ever talked to Bob Glidden in person, which was at the first U.S. Nationals that I announced, was probably the biggest one of those for me. Bob at that point was still in fair health. He was working. Billy was running a pro mod. He was working on the car with Billy. And, of all the drag racers on the great all-time list, I feel like if there's a 1 and a 1A, I really put Bob Glidden on as high a pedestal as I put Don Garlitz in, just because, yes, Garlitz innovated so much stuff and did so many things, but my God, when you look at what Bob Glidden did as a singular entity, he was the only guy running that stuff, and he was just destroying people. And he had a little bit of panache when he did it. He would talk a little trash when he needed to. He knew exactly who he was and how good he was and what he needed to do to win. So of my all-time, drag racing pantheon of heroes, I think Bob Glidden stands very close to the top of that. So when I got to speak to him in person, that was, my hummina, making the cartoon noises type of moment.
It's funny you mentioned Bob Glidden. As we all remember the Diamond P and the VHS tape you were talking about, but I went back when Buddy Ingersoll entered pro stock And I don't know if you remember, I just watched this like about a month ago, and you could tell that
with the turbo car,
with
right?
the turbo car.
Oh,
Yeah. And Bob was,
that.
you know, Bob beat him in the final, and the way that Bob was kind of like you said, he would say, sort of tell it like it is, but he didn't really say it out like he should, like we would, right? You know, pump your chest and so forth.
Yeah.
But it was just cool when he won in the final. He's like, I knew we'd get him, and I knew we'd win that race. I think he was hoping that he would win that race, but when he did, he really let him know that he won that race. But he kind of had that class to do that. And you're right. I've met Bob a few times, and Billy, and good family, good folks there.
Yeah, I mean, they just they raced so hard and so successfully, and just relentless work ethic, and it was just it was cool. And yeah, to your point, you know, when Bob would say something with some teeth in it, he never did it. He always did it with a lot of class. You know, it was never like he never necessarily talked about how bad he whooped up on someone, but he would let you know that he knew he whooped up on him, and it was like, man, this guy's awesome.
Yeah.
So you could tell Brian's a professional. That's what I wanted to say, but I'm not. I don't do this all day. So there you go.
He's pretty good.
He is pretty good. You know, that's a good thing.
No kidding. Brian, one other thing with racing, and aside from the people you've met, so Jim mentioned the column that you wrote, and racing is a very emotional sport. Anybody who's ever raced, if you're not there and you don't want to win, why are you there? So every racer has the goal. They want to be on the top of the pyramid at the end of the day, and that's it. What kind of things over the years have you seen or observed where that adrenaline, that emotion, it is just the dam breaks and here it comes, and you're like, oh boy, here we go. And you know, your responsibility is to interview and get it out in front of people, but how do you do that? What comes to mind when you've had that?
I'll tell you a story that got me in trouble. How about this? Is a good one. So this is before.
These are real good. Now the viewers can really go off.
This is a total inside baseball story that nobody in the world knows, that every's about to hear right now. So I got it.
Summit Racing, you've heard it. Make sure everybody notes this.
Exactly.
So this is Fun Day Friday, and it turned out to be Brian Gets Screamed At Sunday when I tell you the story. So 2017 Pomona. I mean, there's a million of these stories, but I like this one the best because, again, I've never really told it in public. So 2017 at Pomona, Brittany Force wins the Top Fuel Championship. End of the afternoon. It's crazy. It's bedlam. And John kind of collapses to his knees on the starting line. So I'm the starting line announcer for the venue. I'm not working on the TV show yet. In fact, I don't even know how the TV show works. I just know my job is to get good interviews on the starting line that are going out to the fans and going out to NHRA.TV. So John's collapsed on the ground, and I'm looking around. There's nobody coming to talk to him. So, and normally we always have to be deferential to the TV show, right? You want the TV show with that mass audience to get that first initial reaction. So I just got down on my hands and knees right next to him with the microphone. Unbeknownst to me, the TV crew was waiting for this moment to kind of pass. And I gave him 10 seconds. It wasn't like I jumped on top of him, but I'm going in there with the microphone. And all of a sudden in my earpieces start going off, get out, get out, get out. I'm like, I'm not getting out. So I sat in there and I talked to John, and which was, you know, he was very emotional, could barely get any words out. It was certainly a moment of just overwhelming, emotion for him. And then it became one for me because I got my ass chewed so freaking bad by pretty much everybody top to bottom on the TV show. The guy who was kind of producing the event behind me in my ear. And I was like, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? And it's fine. We all ended up by the banquet the next night, everybody was laughing about it. But, that was a moment for me where it's like, you just want to capture it and you want to get it. And it seems like insensitive. I got a lot of crap from people on the internet after that about like, oh, that guy has no idea what he's doing. That guy. And it's like, do you want to see John Force laying on the ground, or do you want to hear what he has to say? Yeah. I want to know want to know what he has to say. And, John is an incredible guy, and he's an incredible. You look at his career arc and you look at his arc of just being a guy who has been so grizzled at this for years. And the John Force we talked to in 2021 is not the John Force that we were talking to in 1985 or 86. This is a guy that's in his 70s. He has incredible accumulated knowledge, and he has incredible accumulated stress with his business and everything else. So that to me was going to be a moment where we weren't going to get John Force that gives you the funny answer and then says, what did you ask me again? That was going to be the John Force that we might not have ever heard of or heard from before. A father who has watched his daughter accomplish something incredible. A father that's, you just think about all the accumulated things that must have been in his mind at that moment. How many times he had won Pomona, how many championships he had won, how many weekends he had spent away from his family to do it, how much time he would have loved to have gotten back from that, how much this particular thing meant to him that his own daughter had, risen to become a champion. So, that to me was an incredibly emotional moment. Clay Millican winning Bristol in 2017 will go down forever as one of the greatest, probably one of the greatest things I've ever seen. I mean, just that day was phenomenal and everything that went along with it. And there's a lot of them. And even on the local level, I'll tell you, I remember, the first time I ever openly totally broke down and cried on the mic was when Dan Page, I think this was 2018. Dan Page is an A-Fuel racer from New Hampshire. He's a chassis builder, a guy that I grew up with when he was racing locally. We had a pro comp class up in New England Dragway that was like old school kind of pro comp class. You had dragsters and altereds and alcohol funny cars in there. And he was a killer in that, became a very successful chassis builder. And then he wins Indy in 2018. And I'm on the mic with Dennis Taylor. And that was it. I was a puddle. I was an absolute puddle. It's like this guy that I was 18 years old, 19, whatever, 20 years old in the tower at New England Dragway, calling him winning a Saturday night match race, just freaking won the U.S. Nationals. And it was a moment that I know he felt of his, professional accomplishment, of the incredible, nature to be able to say he won the U.S. Nationals. But for me, it was like, this is the greatest closure of a loop I'll ever experience. I mean, this is my guy, and he just won Indy. We used to stand in this little tiny tower at Epping watching him race in front of 500 people. We're at the U.S. Nationals on Monday, and he just won. So that was a big one.
That's awesome. That's awesome. As we're steering down this drama, and when we talk about this, me and Al talk about this, like the staging duels and the things that go on.
Yeah.
What was the latest? I think it was Bruno and McGahey and
let's talk about that. Let's get into that.
Should they have been DQ'd? Should they not have been DQ'd? Do we need more of this? Do we need less of this? Do we need
we need all of it. We need all of it. Yeah. Like no less of it. We need all of it. And that was the most talked about pro stock run, which was a non-run, in a decade. Nobody talked more about pro stock in a more passionate way than that. Except I'll equate it to this. Back when, a couple years ago in 19, I guess, when Greg Anderson qualified 16th on purpose to race Erica, that was another one that brought up a lot of people talking, which was fantastic. But for that particular moment with Mason and Bruno, and if Bruno's watching, he's going to come to my house and punch me in the head. But I do think it was the right move. I think the DQ was the right move, only because if you set a precedent that's something that's going to have no particular punishment value to, not to say it's going to happen every time, but it's going to happen a lot. And, one of the things a lot of people don't consider in that situation is once they got past about a minute and a half, a minute 45, neither of them had enough fuel to finish the run.
Sure.
And, it's like when a lot of people are like, well, what would have happened? It's like, well, I'll tell you what. And I told one guy, I said, drain all but about 3 teaspoons of fuel out of the fuel cell of your drag car and go make a full pull and tell me how good it works out for you. Mm-hmm. If you're going to run a pro stock motor bone dry on fuel and have it go dead lean at 8, 9,000, 10,000 RPM, you let me know how that works out for you.
Sure.
Take a $50,000 engine, $60,000 engine, $80,000 engine, and turn it into scrap. Neither guy was willing to do it. So, and that's what made them very smart. And Bruno will tell you straight up, once they got that far into it, he knew he couldn't launch. And the team actually thanked him for not trying to make the run at that point, because they knew what the mechanical consequence would have been. I did an interview with Brad Hardy, who's the chief starter, and I asked him point blank. I said, "Hey, did this come from race control? Where did this come from?" And he said, "The final decision, as it states in the rule book, is mine, and my decision was to disqualify him." And I'm not rooting against either of those guys. Would I have, in my heart of hearts, liked to see him dump some fuel in it and make the rip? I probably would have, but it wouldn't have been near the story it was if they had.
Sure.
So selfishly, I'm kind of glad the DQ happened, only because it created an incredible 2 weeks plus of discussion about pro stock that we wouldn't have had.
It's funny, and we go on a little bit further with I think Funny Car, Pedregon, and I don't remember who else it was when he blipped the throttle, the clutch pedal was stuck.
Wilkerson.
And JR. Okay. Oh, it was JR.
Yeah, you're right.
And here we go. It's up in the media. Everything's there. And you got a lot more people interested in the drama of the sport. So it's all really good. It really is. And I think it's neat.
It reminds me a lot, Brian, you mentioned all the different racing that you've seen and been involved in and enjoyed, all that stuff over the years. It reminds me a lot of before the Car of Tomorrow, and I'm not saying this to be
Sure.
specifically critical of NASCAR. Before the car tomorrow, though, when crew chiefs had the leeway to cheat, it made NASCAR very interesting because there was a lot to talk about. And Smokey Yunick, not that he cheated, but he really read the rule book and was but he and was one of my personal heroes. I've read a bunch of Smokey's books, and I think he was a fascinating person. But when you think about that and you go, okay, that makes the sport interesting. It gets national exposure, news outside of just the immediate media attention. And those things, I agree 100%, Brian. I think it's good for the sport. I think it gives visibility. But to your point, somebody's got to make the call and control that. I was a little surprised they didn't pull him off the line, put him to the back of the pack, let him go around again. And not that I think it's right or wrong. I'm not going to give an opinion one way or the other because I don't run the sanctioning body. NHRA does. They got to make the call. And the starter, and I wouldn't want to be in that fella's shoes. But when you think about it, you go, well, why is that anything bad? Aside from, okay, if they do leave, you're going to have a problem down track. That's going to delay the race, blow stuff up, make a mess, all that. But I agree with you. I think the exposure it gave the sport was great. And it was that, let's give them something to talk about. That's exactly what happened.
And I think,
go ahead. Let me put this in there. Al talked about cheating. It's not cheating. It's innovating. So I just want to get that on the record. Remember,
creative interpretation of the rules.
Absolutely. So we don't call it cheating. We call it innovating.
I like that. That's good. That's good. Good use of the language. Yeah. To me, there's like the end point of that whole thing was of the Mason and Bruno situation was, they got pointed in multiple times, and I don't know. I just ultimately there's a part of me that likes the fact that the starter is still the guy up there with ultimate authority because, we all go back to Buster Couch and obviously Buster was this larger than life guy. And, he had his moments where he was jerking people out of cars and doing the stuff he needed to do. But I do that job is important and that job needs to be viewed as important and it needs to be respected as being important. So I do like the fact that like after the fact, NHRA didn't come out and say, yeah, well, race control decided this was the thing, or that Brad said, no, race control told me to do that. I mean, it was at his discretion. And listen, I know neither guy was happy about it. Mason's a much quieter guy and as a younger guy than Bruno. And he was probably a little bit less distraught about it, but Bruno took it hard and I would too, if I'm a racer, I'm not. So the fact that it created as much discussion as it was, I think, or did is a great sign for the fact that Pro Stock is a category that people do care about. Pro Stock is a category that people do get into their feelings about. And it kind of reinforces that point. And if we're talking about Pro Stock, I mean, that's a category that a few years ago was in very difficult shape. And I think you look at Greg Anderson, you look at Richard Freeman, you look at some of the names in that category of them making a concerted effort to make it a more accessible place to go racing. And now all of a sudden we got 20 plus of those cars every race. We got Camry Caruso coming in full time next year. We got other people that I've been hearing about coming in. We have a new engine supplier coming with Titan Racing engines to add to the, Frank Iaconio Elite KB. Now you're going to have Titan in there. So again, and the reason we're having this conversation is because of that run. If those guys didn't have that situation, we wouldn't be talking about Pro Stock right now, right?
True. Yeah. You're right. If you're really in the depth of the drag racing world, with Camry coming in next year and all these up and comings, I think Greg Anderson or Jason may have said that, these 20 somethings or sometimes these late teen drivers coming in and redefining the class, you know what I mean? But it's making the, let's say more tenured drivers get more on their game. It's, as they say, it's one at the tree, but it's neat to see all these new faces get in there and new dramas are coming, right? New talks are coming, new staging battles are coming. So it's pretty neat.
No, it really is. It really is. And you look at a guy like Dallas Glenn, who I know so much a supporter of, and this guy's a Rookie of the Year candidate. He's a guy that is the old school drag racing story that we don't necessarily hear that much anymore. He's a crew guy that worked his ass off, that dreamed about doing this his whole life. And he got the shot and he didn't screw it up. Not that he didn't screw it up. He took the shot and he's run with it. So it is incredibly, it's that story, man. That's the old story, right? That's the old 60s, 70s, 80s story of the Larry Dixons of the world and the crew guys, the Robert Heights of the world that worked on a crew and then become a driver and become a champion. Well, this kid's a championship level competitor. And it's again, emotional, heartwarming story that this guy who just did what he needed to do, put his head down and worked and worked and worked and knew he could do it. And when he got the chance, he took advantage of it.
Yeah, and Brian, you mentioned Dallas, and he's, obviously we're affiliated with him, the whole KB team. Dallas is a great, great guy, great representative for our brand, great representative for the sport. I loved the track walk Amanda did with him.
Yeah.
Because to your point, the history and so, we've known him for a while because obviously we've been involved with the team. But when people who don't know him see that, like from the outside looking in, it's like, oh, well, maybe he's got a rich dad who wrote a check for it. No, that's absolutely not what happened. And Amanda, I think, just did a fantastic job with that. And I really enjoy those because every time there is something in there, even with Dallas, as long as we've known him, I learn a few things during that. So I really appreciate that during the broadcast. And I think y'all do a great job of those. It's really, really fantastic.
Yeah, those stories are super important for us to tell because that's that's something that's going to endear people to Dallas. That's how Dallas gains fan base, right? That's how Dallas becomes more of a household name when we talk about NHRA drag racing is when people go, oh, wait, this is a regular guy who bled from his hands for years to be able to do this. So that's what definitely gets people leaning forward in their chair when he races for sure.
Yeah, absolutely true. So Brian, with your typical weekend, so we were talking before this started about how I can't keep up with you. Like you're all over the place. You're always somewhere, always announcing. Typical year, this year with COVID was a little goofy, but you and Freiberger with Drag Week, you got that, which is awesome. And David's a good friend of the company's and ours as well. Great guy. I'm sure you have a blast with that. You do no prep events, lights out. I mean, you're all over. How do you prep for a weekend? Because you have so many things on your plate. Like can you walk us through like, okay, it's Wednesday or Thursday or whenever you start your prep, how do you get ready? How do you go in? Because you are incredibly well prepared. I love watching the races when you're announcing. I mean, not when, you're always announcing, but when you're on, I've never watched one and thought, wow, Brian wasn't ready for that, or he wasn't on his game. You always are, and it fascinates me with that many events. How in the world do you do it?
Obviously you gotta develop a plan, and you certainly have to develop, if not a system, a methodology. So for my NHRA events, the method is pretty much the same there because obviously following the series every race, you kind of know what's going on. But I would show you. Well, I'll dig up some paperwork here in a second. I'll show you some stuff that I work on. But I work closely with our NHRA on Fox group, and we keep weekly stats, and then I take those weekly stats and translate them into, a kind of a one-sheeter that I have on every class and every driver that's in, and that one-sheeter has some potential storylines, has their reaction time average, has all the really kind of hard data that we want to look at on a run-to-run basis. I want to know if Justin Ashley's averaging a 51 light and he's racing, let's say he's racing Antron, who's averaging 60, like we can set that storyline up. Like these guys should pretty much leave dead even. So there are those type of storylines. It becomes very different when you're doing an event outside of NHRA or outside of a, super well documented series. So like for the radial stuff, especially at Donald's races, I have developed this massive binder book of all my notes that I've kept over the years. So I basically build on that each and every year. A lot of prep for stuff like that comes off of the internet. Like I want to know where these guys are racing, where they last won, if they made any mechanical changes to the car. I'm picking up the phone and making phone calls. I'm touching base with chassis builders. Has anybody's stuff been in and out of there? Much in the same way an NFL reporter or broadcaster is calling coaches and talking to trainers and talking to their sources within the league. I'm doing the same thing for drag racing, and it really is almost the same process. And one of the things that I think is super important for the younger guys I talk to is that idea, not that it's foreign to them, but they don't know how to do it and they don't know how to start doing it. And like I tell a lot of guys that race that have their local bracket announcers, I say, like, what do you do week to week? And they're like, well, I show up and announce the race, which is fine. And the majority of people that announce drag races just show up and announce the race. And there's nothing really wrong with that. But if you don't treat it like it's a craft and you don't treat it seriously, then I don't feel like you should be expecting to move ahead in your career. It's like anything else. If you want to play the violin, I would suggest you probably practice playing the violin before you show up for a concert, right? Sure. You know the sheet music. And so for me, that early lesson at New Hampshire International Speedway, when the guy said, hey man, like you can be as enthusiastic as you want, but you got to know what you're talking about. I never forgot that. So it is if you're a local weekly track announcer, you have access to the run sheets, you have access to who won the week before, you have access to how many times they've won that season. There's no reason why you can't show up to your next week having gone over those run sheets during the week and say, man, this guy was 006 for 6 rounds in a row. This guy that won the race has done this or that. And to me, that's the baby step to get you started. You work with the information that you can find, but you go and you actually put the work in. And so when I roll into an NHRA race, it is a different style of prep, again, because when we're racing 4 or 5 weeks in a row, I certainly know who won last week, but I still go through the same process to make sure that I have the information I'm going to need at hand. And then Bob Fry is still involved with our broadcast as quietly as many people don't know that, but well behind the scenes, he'll be watching the race at home. There are things that simply I can't dig up between rounds. We'll get an email to either myself or this Jen Lorenz, who works in our graphics production department of the show, and she'll send off and forward me stuff. Hey, Bob sent this in. I don't think I can use it in a graphic, but maybe you want to slide it in. So, Bob can go deep into his records and find stuff that I have no hope of ever finding. So when you roll into a radial race or Donald's race, I want to know how many times this guy won lights out. I want to know what he did last year. I want to know what he did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And because those events, yes, there's coverage of those events. And yes, you can work, your Google fingers to the bone to find stuff. I've always just built on accumulated data that I've kept and written down and run sheets and qualifying orders and stuff like that. So it's different. And then I just did a vintage road racing event up in Detroit on our weekend off between between St. Louis and Dallas. I went up and did a vintage road racing event at the M1 concourse in Detroit. Oh, cool. And that was a neat departure for me of something I've wanted to do for a long time, just to kind of stretch my legs a little bit and do something different. And I love basically all forms of racing, and certainly racing history. If you follow my Instagram, you've seen that. But that was a whole different style of prep, because there I got a list of all the cars that were going to be there. And so it was less about the drivers, because a lot of these guys are not to be disrespectful, they're amateur racers or they're collectors. They're not necessarily race car drivers. So the story is the cars. So for that event, it was cool because it was, getting the information on the, 1972 dihedral wing Parnelli Jones Indy car, or Joe Leonard's turbine car from 1968, or a couple of the little like prototypes and Lolas and sports cars we had there. So, and I got to work with David Hobbs at that event. I mean, frickin' David Hobbs. It was amazing.
That's cool. That's cool. It's funny, the transition when you mentioned what your prep and Al mentions. I gotta be honest with you, as the local retail store manager here in Ohio, every Monday during race season, I go out and see who won all the local stuff. Yep. They may be coming in, you want to relate to those folks. A lot of them are my friends. I've been doing this a long time, but that's my prep as well. The more you know locally or in your customer base, the better off that you are, just to communicate.
I ought to be researching who blew their stuff up and send them a coupon. That's what I got to work on.
Marketing guy, see how he is.
Bam. There you go.
That's we got to take care of our customers.
You're right.
You're right. I got to do better at that. I'm failing at that.
Well,
I'll tell you, if it was,
you got people. I'm sure.
It's my takeaway from the thing.
There you go.
I'm going to work
after the Bristol weekend. He could have just airdropped them on top of the racetrack as we blew up.
We were going to hire a plane to fly over and just throw them out of the plane. Yeah. Here, everybody take one.
That happens.
Yeah, no kidding. Brian, at all the tracks you've been to, I am sure Indy absolutely resonates. You mentioned home track. I'm sure there's a couple places. But what other tracks? Obviously, we know Summit Motorsports Park has got to be your favorite track. Pound ice cream for $1. The baiters are awesome. But outside of that, so we already know your favorite track outside of those two is Summit Motorsports. What other tracks have you been to, though, that you say, this is a really awesome track? And almost like, I always love telling our customers about places they may not be familiar with. Like, hey, if you've never been here, you ought to go here and check it out. Like, I remember years ago, I went to Watkins Glen for an endurance race, and I went up there, and I'm like, this place is awesome. And I'd never been there before. And I wish somebody 10 years ago would have said, hey, you got to go there. Yeah. Where have you been when you look at it and say, you know what, this is a really awesome place. People got to go.
So I've been to over 170 drag strips now, counting tracks that are existent and tracks that are abandoned, or the sites of tracks that have been abandoned or gone out of business. So George Ray's drag strip is a place that every drag racing fan should get to and experience, because it boils this sport down to its most basic bones and elements. It's a very cool place. It is. If we have a Z-Max, we also have to have a George Ray's. You have to have both ends of that spectrum and cycle. I've been to the drag strip in Saudi Arabia. When we went over there for the Global Auto Salon a couple years ago, we took a day trip out. We met the track operator on, I think, a Wednesday, and he sent some Suburbans over. We hopped in and went on about an hour ride outside of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to the drag strip there. That was an amazing place, and we got to help that guy out some. He talked about how slow his program runs, and he was trying to figure out ways to make it faster. And we mentioned the fact that he needs to cut a hole in the wall. He's got a drag strip that's a mile plus long, and both sides of it have an unbroken wall all the way down to the end. It's like, dude, you need a turnoff. You got a guy running an 11-second car. He doesn't need to go a mile.
Sure.
I was like, oh, okay.
Sure.
So that was really cool. Summit Racing Equipment Motorsports Park. And again, I'm not just saying it. It's to me the most unique drag strip on earth, because it's a massive place that still feels like a hometown racetrack. And it's there's nowhere else I think we go that has that duality. New England Dragway is a small little racetrack. It's a very cozy, intimate place. It's bursting at the seams when we have a national event there. Summit handles the event comfortably, but yet it still feels like you have tens of thousands of people there, and it still feels like you're at your hometown drag strip. So it is an incredibly unique place. Sonoma, California is a place that I tell people we race there, and they're like, does anybody show up? And it's like, yeah, we sell the place out every year. But you just think about it, when we think about where people live and how they live and what their interests are, you think, an hour north of San Francisco in a winery area, you're going to have a drag race. And it's like, oh, we're not going to have a drag race. We're going to have a big drag race. And so, all those places are great. And abandoned places, you can go if you live in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, put Shuffletown Park into your Google Maps and drive to it. Just walk past the swing set down over the ridge, and you'll be standing on what was one Shuffletown drag strip. The drag strip's still there. They just built a public park around it. So loads of places like that. I've been to places that you got to walk a quarter mile into the woods to find anymore because the trees have grown up around them. And that's one of the things Freiberger and I do every year on Drag Week, is try to find either visit places we haven't been to or find some places that don't exist anymore, stuff like that. I give you a long list, man. There's a place called Nahunta Drag Strip I've been to that is not quite. It's a little bit shorter than an 1/8 mile, and the shutdown area is a hard stop on the back banking of a dirt track. I mean, there's a lot of really crazy places. Oh yeah, it's a high stakes.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of guys will show up down there. They'll go race there.
Yeah, why not? Sure. I'm sure you've been asked this before. So if somebody was like, all right, you got a full bill to race for the whole season, would you be a racer, and what would you do? Where's your heart? Or if you could say that, if it's fuel, pro mod, small tire, what would you?
I'll tell you what, like, it's funny because I've never had any real, I mean, I loved racing with my dad when I was a kid, but I've never had any desire to be a race car driver. Honest to God, I like watching them. I like studying them and trying to understand them and their psychology and watching them do what they do and exhibit those skills. I don't have any of those skills, and I would be, whatever you stuck me in, I would not be good at it. So if I was given a full run of anything and told I could do whatever I wanted with it, I would field the top fuel team. That's what I would do. If I would be a team owner, and I would field the top fuel team, because then I could be critical of the driver to do something I couldn't do myself.
Understand. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I like to ask that question because you never know. Some people don't want to race. Some people like to be the car chief, the crew chief, or the track guy. You know what I mean? So not everybody wants to be a driver. You don't have to be either.
My current project is a 1940s Ford 8N tractor. So that gives you an idea of what I my idea of high speed is right there. Fourth gear in that thing's good enough for me.
Nice. Awesome. Brian, if you could change anything about drag racing today, we talked earlier about pro stock. It's great to see the class healthy again, number of cars. The one element of pro stock I miss is I grew up in the Warren Johnson, Glidden, that era where every automaker, Alderman, every automaker was involved in it.
Yeah.
My friends I grew up with in Cincinnati, Edgewater was our home track, would always debate about Ford versus Chevy. At the time, I was really just a Chevy guy. I love all of them, but a little partial to Chevy.
Sure. My
friends, Mike and Jeff, Ford guys, they'd always tell me Glidden was the best. I'd tell them Johnson was the best. We'd fight like crazy, but it was always fun. And I miss that. That's one part of pro stock that if I could change one thing, it would be get the OEs back involved in pro stock. So we had all the different body styles and more involvement. It's good to see the other, the new entrant coming in, which is exciting. But what would you change if you had one thing you could say, or more than one thing, whatever you want to change? What would you do? Wave the magic wand, make it happen.
Yeah, I would concentrate this probably on pro stock and pro mod. I would vastly diversify the bodies selection in pro mod, and some efforts have been made over the years to give some weight breaks for the older bodies and stuff like that. Um, that's a big one because, you know, my favorite category growing up was pro modified, still one of my favorite classes in the entire sport. And, you know, as a kid that kind of came of age in drag racing in the 90s, it was the exploding thing was, you know, Scotty Cannon, Ed Hoover, Mike Ashley, all these early racers, Shannon Jenkins, Steve Vick. You go right down the list of all these guys that were the real kind of, even the fastest streetcar style stuff. But it's funny because I had this conversation yesterday with a friend that pro mod has always been this class of too much of. So early on, it was, too many nitrous cars, not enough blower cars. Then it became too many blower cars, not enough nitrous cars. Then it became too many 63 Corvettes. Then it was too many 53 Studebakers. Then it was too many turbo cars. Now it's too many Pro Charger cars. Now it's too many late model Camaros. So the class has always been the class of too many. But I really would like to see some representation of the old school body styles, certainly some more representation of the showmanship of years past in that category. A lot of beautiful cars out there, but we don't necessarily see the beautiful cars like we did back in the day when the concentration was really on, you know, paint and names and maybe some match race money on the side and stuff like that. It has professionalized itself, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you get professionalized, there's consequences with that, right? We have to make sure that we have a prominence of the sponsor on the car. We have to make sure that sponsor's name is readily able to be read. We need to make sure we have a fast car that's aerodynamic. So that's why we're all going to run this late model Camaro body, because we're going 250 miles an hour. The logic chain is unassailable. You know why it happens. Sure. So trying to untie that knot is a difficult thing. And then in pro stock, Al, to your point, absolutely. I think that, you know, the 500 cubic inch formula that was developed and released in the early 80s was the absolute right move for the time. And it was, if I could wave my magic wand and go back to about 1990, I would start to move away from that 500 cubic inch formula. And I think because of the fact that you've had that 500 cubic inch formula now coming up on what will be 40 years next year, 82 to 2022, right? It's tough to get away from that. I think the way that you attract the OEs, of course, is you move toward a more OE based power plant in the cars. You move toward more OE based bodies on the cars. And again, at this point, you're talking about a new class, right? You cannot look at a group of dozens of racers that have millions upon millions of dollars invested in their equipment and say, hey, by the way, we're just going to make all that, you know, we're going to make all that obsolete. So,
switch, right.
Yeah. So to me, I think there is room in the NHRA and in all door slammer drag racing for a new factory style class that inevitably will start out something very small, and hopefully it catches interest and fire and we see it grow ahead. But I think, you know, I don't think we're too far away from potentially seeing something that will be of interest to more than just the big three. I think there's a lot of good stuff in the works that may be of interest to manufacturers globally, as opposed to just the big three in drag racing. So, you know, no guarantees, but you may want to just pay attention for something.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. I think it's interesting that the OE involvement at the factory stock level.
Sure.
Yeah. You know, the Cobra Jet, Hemi, Copo Shootout. I think that class, to me, I love watching that. And man, are those cars fast.
Yes,
they are unreal.
Wicked fast. They really are. Incredible.
Yeah, I could see that platform, Brian, at some point, but, you know, whole other discussion. Stay tuned to Brian Lunds and his podcast, because he will fill you in as soon. Brian, speaking of that, let's talk about your podcast. I've sent you messages in the past. You've had a number of episodes that have resonated with me. I love it. Tell me about how you're set up. Tell the listeners where to go to find it, all that good stuff.
Sure. So we got two. We have the NHRA Insider podcast, which is released every single week, and that's always involving NHRA drag racing. Typically in season, we're talking to sportsman racers or pro racers that are either winners or people who have had an impact or people that have done something, you know, of note in the last week. Then we get to the off season, it gets a little bit more fun because I get to kind of expand who I'm going to have on the show. We get to kind of go a little bit more off the reservation, and we plan on doing some pretty interesting stuff this off season, you know, with the tech department, with some other elements of NHRA drag racing that people either don't hear a lot from or get a lot of publicity outside of, you know, getting arrows shot at them when they make a decision. So we're going to kind of enlighten people on some of that stuff. And my other podcast is the Dorkomotive podcast, which is about it's about anything and everything. And it's been a little while since I put one of those out, but I have some episodes that I'm creating now that should be out in the next few weeks. And that ranges all different types of racing topics. So there's a show about Art Arfons that is kind of the definitive, at least I think it is, kind of like the definitive story of his racing life. Humpy Wheeler, a bunch of different guests on that one, a bunch of different racing related shows, the history of the Great American Truck Racing Series, which is a very popular episode about big rig super speedway racing in the 80s. So you can find that one. Dorkomotive Podcast, also where fine podcasts are sold on the internet, and it's free. Like all podcasts, it is free and worth every penny.
Awesome. Brian, let's talk a little bit about some of the other things you do outside NHRA. Sure. So the no prep, small tire, radial, all the different crazy stuff. Yeah. Where do you see that going, and where do you see that growing? And I know for NHRA, it's a challenge, because how do you incorporate that like at a national event level? It's very challenging. So they already have a big program, a lot of things going on. But from your perspective, where do you see that part of our sport going?
To me, it's in an interesting place right now. And I think you're seeing a transition, and especially in radial racing, you're seeing a transition there, and you're seeing a transition away from, radial versus the world, which has been the kind of ruling category in that part of drag racing for several years. Once the elapsed times went into the 340s, it was kind of once they went into the 360s, a lot of guys looked around and said, I just can't compete with this. I need to find another place. And that's where a class like Pro 275 was born, which is also, escalating quickly in performance. So to a degree, I think we have seen the peak of radial versus the world in terms of its participation. Now, there's still some very good cars in there. Brian Markowitz had himself a great weekend at South Georgia Motorsports Park at No Mercy very recently. You have categories like X275 and Ultra Street, as well as limited drag radial, that continue to be popular and strong. It's like anything else. And, for as much criticism as NHRA or any sanctioning body gets for rules management, that's one of the things that has been, a tough thing to manage in radial racing. And X275 and John Sears, that guy is a saint as far as drag racing goes in my book. You may agree or disagree with what he does, but the fact that guy has done this for as long as he has and shepherded over the X275 category and taken the slings and arrows and taken the screaming and yelling and the good and the bad with that class is pretty amazing. And, we saw X275 cars running like way down in the bottom fours. And I think that moving that needle backwards, which they have done to a degree, has been good for that class, because you just don't want people to feel like they can't compete and showing up. And I think when we look at the history of, small tire drag racing, it is really a category that has always spawned its new classes because of performance enhancement. And the new classes aren't born because of the fastest guys. The new classes are born because of the slower guys go, hey, we need somewhere else to race. And they create a class and figure it out. That's where the Ultra Street and even several other ones have come from in that regard. So radial racing is in a different place than it was a few years ago. And I don't necessarily think it's in a bad place, but it's like transitioning. I know, next year they have this championship series, which I think is a good thing. I think there's, a lot of sponsorship support for that. It's going to be run at, a handful of the most high profile radial style events. And so that is going to be a good thing in terms of just organization and getting people out on the road and helping car counts at certain events that may need a little help in that regard. When we look at radial racing, I think the backside of it that is even more impressive is Pro Mod. The Pro Mod class, you look at all these different places where you can go run your Pro Mod, and there are different rule sets all over the place, but they're not that far apart. So, you got the Snowbirds Outlaw Nationals coming up down in Bradenton in a few weeks. And he's got 50 cars pre-entered for that thing. 50th anniversary of the event. He's got 50 cars entered for that. And so there was a time where it looked like, oh man, the Pro Mods are just going to go away and everyone's just going to run radials. Well, that didn't happen. A lot of the radial guys have put the big tires back on and they go Pro Mod racing. So, if anything, what all of this means is that people in drag racing in 2021, whether they want to believe it or not, especially if you're an old person, you might want to block your ears here. You have more options to run your car in more different places and in more methods and distances and brackets and indexes and whatever you want to do. You have more options now than you've ever had in the history of the sport. If you have a car that can run eights, you can go index race it. You can put small tires on it, go radial race it. You can go bracket race it. You can go run it. I mean, you can do whatever. You can go run drag week with it. I mean, think about that. Think about 30 years ago, what you did with your race car. You had one class, probably a one track you went and ran, and that was what you did. I mean, the sport has changed so much and there's so many options out there. It spread people out some. It certainly spread the radial cars out some when localized and regionalized programs have come up. So some of the major highline events maybe don't have quite the killer car count they had in years past because of the fact that guys go, I can run this regional series. It's more my budget. It's maybe more my elapsed time level, performance level. But the converse side of that's a positive, is it elevates those big events. Much like the U.S. Nationals is always an elevation of an NHRA national event because people make the commitment to go there to compete with national level competition as opposed to just racing people regionally. So again, super long-winded answer to your question, but radial racing is in, I'm not going to say it's in a bad place. It's in a transitional place right now. And where it goes over the next 2 years, I think will really be dependent on rules management and the leadership of the classes.
You know, Brian, you bring up a good point. Just get out and race.
Yes.
Right. You know what I mean? I think NMCA just announced stock, super stock classes, index racing, radial racing, small tire racing. It's all over now. It's disseminated into this huge thing where it just isn't at your local track anymore. And I think it's evolved to that. It really has. So wherever you're at, eight seconds is still fast.
Yeah.
I mean, 10 seconds. Get a 10-second car. Anybody that tells you a 10-second car isn't fast has never been in a 10-second car. You know what I mean?
Just get out there. Enjoy yourself and go to your local track and support it. And you know what? There's a lot of good times to be had as we've seen them, you know, coming up through all the years. You know, one thing I want to comment on, I couldn't imagine, God rest his soul, Johnny Rocca doing the old rain dance like he used to do when Tin Indian used to run. You know, that's the stuff that you really miss. And Animal Jim and those guys doing their thing, their showmanship. But you bring up some good memories.
The first time I ever met Johnny Rocca was the very first IHRA national event. I was allowed to sneak in the tower. The very first IHRA event that Joe Lombardo talked them into letting me come in and announce, like, you know, Super Rod or something like that up at Epping, that got me going with them. But Johnny Rocca was there, and he was like guesting out. He was running the Iron Horse Mercury with Paul Athey at the time. Remember that car? The Mohegan Sun car was awesome.
Sure.
And so I walked into the tower, and I had been working in tech that morning, so I had a pen tucked behind my ear. I had a notebook shoved in my pocket, and I walked in the tower, and he looked at me and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, they asked me to come up here and like announce Super Rod." He goes, "Oh, I thought you were a carpenter." He's like, "I thought you were here to fix something." I said, "No, they had me come up here to do this little trial for Super Rod." So Johnny was, God rest his soul, is a great guy. Yeah.
It's great. Those guys, the Scotty Cannons, that really was the showmanship. And now you're right. It is a sport of Pro Mod is a sport of too many. You know, I mean, we missed the Mercuries, we missed the Willies, we missed the 55s and things of that nature. You know, but it was a neat deal. But it's transitioned into definitely 250 miles an hour, where those bodies may not be as forgiving as the new style.
Yeah, no doubt. So, Jim, we've talked about a lot. Brian, we've talked about a lot. Anything, Brian, you want to share with the listeners before? We've taken a lot of your time. I know you're busy. You got, you know, something you got to prep for, I'm sure, at some point today. But anything else you want to share with our listeners? And thank you for joining us.
No, I just, just thanks for having me on. It's a great conversation. We touched on a lot of different stuff. And if you're, if you're out there watching this and you're an aspiring announcer, someone who wants to do this or someone who does do it, and you want some advice, you want some coaching, you want some ideas, you want to be told what not to do, you want to be told what to do, or who to work for and who not to work for, you can email me, or you can just find me, shoot me a note on Instagram, at Brian Lohnes. My email is brianlohnes@gmail.com. And anybody that's wants to get in this field and has questions, I'm more than happy to answer them and try to help you along.
Awesome, Brian. Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We know you're busy. You're always somewhere. You're always announcing. We love the fact that you're just elbow deep into this all the time. So, and love hearing you call every race that we watch too. So thank you so much today, Brian. Summit Racing fans, thank you for joining us today for Facebook Friday. Jim and I can't thank you enough for being customers of ours. And hit the like button, hit the share button, subscribe to all of our social channels, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, all of them. We're on all those channels. Please follow us. And again, we really appreciate you being our customers. Thank you so much. Have a great Friday. Have a great weekend. And go